Today I'm going to be reading War of the Flea, the classic study of guerrilla warfare, by Robert Tabor. I'm skipping the foreword because it was written by some DC rat, piece of trash, mentioning some of the things written in this book about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in the Middle East. All garbage, of course, but if you'd like to hear it, let me know in the comments of either my YouTube video or in the thread on 8chan's PDFs board. You aren't missing much, though, which is why I've decided to skip it. Chapter 1, The Wind of Revolution, Popular Will as the Key to Strategy, the Confrontation of the Haves and Have-Nots, Fallacies of Counterinsurgency, Guerrilla War as an Extension of Politics, Cracks in the Armor of the Modern State. Over the communist-dominated district of Ben Ket rendezvoused the largest helicopter armada in the history of warfare, 96 choppers carrying rockets, machine guns, and 1,000 assault troops. Supported by 4,000 infantrymen, rangers, and counter-guerrilla squads, the attack force hoped to encircle an estimated 1,500 to 2,000 Viet Cong main force troops who 2 weeks earlier had mauled 4 government battalions in a carefully executed ambush. The big airlift was the war's worst kept secret. In Saigon, government information officers alerted photographers several days in advance. When the troops hit the Ben Cat touchdown, most of the Viet Cong had already slipped away. Time, August 21st, 1964. 2 South Vietnamese ranger companies fanned out across the flat grassland and scrub jungle 25 miles north of Saigon. On a routine mission to relieve an outpost attached by communist Viet Cong guerrillas, the 200 men moved cautiously. They paused in a grove of rubber trees, then emerged into a field and headed toward a cluster of huts 400 yards away. Suddenly, from all sides, the fierce cattle and clatter of gunfire erupted. Men crumpled before they heard the noise. Others scattered. Lieutenant William Richter, their wiry American advisor, dived into the soggy ground. Looking up, he saw Viet Cong regulars in green fatigues advancing for the kill. Richter leaped to his feet and ran for cover, but other Viet Cong riflemen crouched at the fringe of the field caught him in a murderous crossfire. Bullets slammed into his thigh. He fell, crawled into the sheltering underbrush, and somehow kept going. For 6 hours, helped by survivors, he dragged himself back to Bin Mai, his home base. He was lucky. On the field beyond the rubber trees, 51 Rangers lay dead. Quote, "They just lured us through a trap door, closed it in on our behinds, and let us have it," Richter later explained. "We were caught flat-footed and cut to pieces." "The same damn story," a senior U.S. officer in Saigon grumbled. "Different only in detail or degree. Similar stories unfold week after week in South Vietnam. Posts are raided, officials assassinated, hamlets burned, towns assaulted, and they all add up to one gloomy conclusion. Despite inferior firepower and strength, the Communists are beating a South Vietnamese force of more than 400,000 soldiers, backed up by 17,000 American advisors and nearly $2 million a day in United States aid." Stanley Carnow, This Is Our Enemy. Saturday Evening Press, August 22, 1964. This is guerrilla war. The Guerra de Guerrillas, fought by Spanish partisans against Napoleon's invading army, refined in our time to a politico-military quasi-science, part Marxist-Leninist social theory, part tactical innovation. That is changing the power relationships of the post-World War II era, and in the process is destroying the verities of the Western general staffs, whose professional concern it is, and increasingly will be, to understand and to combat it. Guerrilla war has become the political phenomenon of the mid-20th century, the visible wind of revolution, stirring hope and fear on 3 continents. At this writing, it is being waged in a score of countries, from Angola to Iraq, and from the Congolese bush to the suburban slums of Caracas. As the American commitment in Vietnam deepens, it has become the first concern of the Pentagon, the Central Intelligence Agency, the National Security Council, the White House. It is being fought in a desperate, often silent struggle in our own hemisphere, in Guatemala, Venezuela, Colombia, and it threatens, or almost threatens, to break out in the United States itself. Certainly, it influences the thinking of Negro militants from Harlem to the Deep South. Gasoline bombs bursting in city streets not long ago gave tangible evidence of that influence. In the world at large, it is destroying the vast vestiges of feudalism and of traditional colonialism where these remain. Its full vigor is turned now against neo-colonialism and against what, in Marxist terminology, is called imperialism. The economic and political, and often military, domination of the weak, industrially poor nations by the rich, powerful, and technologically superior ones. Within the technologically backward areas, it is liberating the masses of the poor from the oppression of the privileged land-owning and mercantile classes, from the oligarchies and the military juntas. And in the process, so it is charged, and so it may happen, it is delivering them to another sort of tyranny, that of the authoritarian socialist state. Viewed from one standpoint, it is a potent weapon, a sword of national liberation and social justice. Viewed from another, it is a subversive and sinister process, a sort of plague of dragon's teeth, sown in confusion, nourished in the soil of social dissension, economic disruption, and political chaos, causing armed fanatics to spring up where the peaceful peasants toiled. In its total effect, it is creating new alignments and a new confrontation of powers that vitally relates to and yet transcends the Cold War. It is a confrontation, in its essence, of the world's haves and the world's have-nots, of the rich nations and the poor nations. It is reshaping the world that we have known, and its outcome may well decide the form and substance of the foreseeable future, not only in the present theaters of war, which are vast and shadowy, but everywhere. The question then arises, what is it? What can be done about it or with it? How to end it or to exploit it? Is it something that can be turned off and on at will? As an instrument of national policy or political expedience? On the available evidence, most of it is concentrated in a span of 20 years or so of what may be called the post-colonial period. A definition offers itself that will, in turn, suggest answers to other questions. Guerrilla war, in the larger sense in which we have been discussing it, is revolutionary war, engaging a civilian population or a significant part of such a population against the military forces of established or usurpative governmental authority. The circumstances may vary. In one instance, Israel and Algeria serve as examples. The authority may be alien, that is, colonial, and its opposition virtually the entire native population, led by a vanguard of militants. In another set of circumstances, South Vietnam or Cuba, for example, the authority may be a native, at least nominally independent government, and the insurgency initiated by a small political faction challenging the policies, ideology, or legitimacy of the regime. Again, the cases vary. The War of the Viet Cong is ideological, with a strong class basis, and at the same time is powerfully nationalistic. Although led by communists, it appeals not only to those who see it as a war against poverty and exploitation, but also those who are repelled by the corruption of the ruling hierarchy. It attracts those who will no longer tolerate military dictatorship, and the multitude of Vietnamese nationalists. Patriots is the term we would use if speaking of ourselves in a similar situation, who consider the conflict a confrontation of the long colonial struggle against the French, today replaced by foreigners of another stripe. The Americans who support and direct a secession of Vietnamese military juntas in the name of liberty and democracy. Where the war in South Vietnam has ideological and nationalistic roots, the revolution in Cuba had none that were visible. It began rather as the idealistic protest of a tiny faction of uncertain political orientation, vaguely liberal, vaguely socialistic, tinged with Spanish anarchism, against the corruption and oppression of a police state. Class rivalries were not evident. Nationalism was not an apparent factor. The clash with foreign and feudal interests, the anti-Americanism, the militant proletarianism, and Marxist slogans of the Cuban Revolution were later developments, following rather than leading to the overthrow of Batista. In Morocco, 1952 to 1956, the nationalists of the Istiqlal built their cause around the symbolic figure of the exiled Sultan, Mohammed Sidi ben Yosef, and forced the abdication of the pretender and the dissolution of the French protectorate. In Israel, powerful religious and ethnic drives gave the struggle for the Jewish national homeland the character of a holy war. In much of Africa, Congo, Cameroon, Angola, tribal rivalries and ambitions appear to play as great a part as does anti-colonialism. Nationalism, social justice, race, religion, beneath all of these symbolic and abstract causes that are rallying cries of the revolutions of the past 2 decades, one discovers a unifying principle, a common mainspring. It is revolutionary impulse, an upsurge of popular will that really has very little to do with questions of national or ethnic identity, or self-determination, or forms of government, or social justice. The familiar shibboleths of political insurgency. You gotta highlight that. It is not even certain that economic deprivation in itself is the decisive factor that is widely assumed to be. Poverty and oppression are, after all, conditions of life on the planet that have been endured by countless generations with scarcely a murmur. The will to revolt, so widespread as to be almost universal today, seems to be something more than a reaction to political circumstances or material conditions. What it seems to express is a newly awakened consciousness, not of causes but of potentiality. It is a spreading awareness of the possibilities of human existence, coupled with a growing sense of the casual nature of the universe, that together inspire first in individuals, then in communities and entire nations, an entirely new attitude toward life. The effect of this sudden awareness, this sudden fruition of consciousness, is to produce in the so-called backward areas of the world, all at once, a pervasive and urgent desire for radical change based on the new insight, startling in its simplicity, that the conditions of life that had seemed immutable can, after all, be changed. Limitations that were formerly accepted all at once become intolerable. The hint of imminent change suggests opportunities that had not been glimpsed until now. The will to act is born. It is as though people everywhere were saying, "Look, here is something we can do, or have, or be, simply by acting. Then what have we been waiting for? Let us act." This, at any rate, describes the state of mind of the modern insurgent, the guerrilla fighter, whatever his slogans or his cause, and his secret weapon, above and beyond any question of strategy or tactics or techniques of irregular warfare, is nothing more than the ability to inspire this state of mind in others. His secret weapon, above and beyond any question of strategy or tactics or techniques of irregular warfare, is nothing more than the ability to inspire this state of mind in others. The defeat of the military enemy, the overthrow of the government, are secondary tasks, in the sense that they come later. The primary effort in the guerrilla is to militate the population, without whose consent no government can stand for a day. The guerrilla is subversive of the existing order in that he is the disseminator of revolutionary ideas. His actions lend force to his doctrine and show the way to radical change. Yet it would be an error to consider him as a being apart from the seed bed of revolution. He himself is created by the political climate in which revolution becomes possible, and is himself as much an expression as he is a catalyst of the popular will towards such change. To understand this much is to avoid two great pitfalls, two serious areas of confusion into which counterinsurgency specialists seem to fall. One such pitfall is the conspiracy theory, the view that revolution is the usually deformed offspring of a process of artificial insemination, and that the guerrilla nucleus, the fertilizing agent, so to speak, is made up of outsiders, conspirators, political zombies, in other words, actual or spiritual aliens who somehow stand separate from their social environment while manipulating it to obscure and sinister ends. The other is the methods fallacy, held, at least until very recently, by most American military men. The old-fashioned notion that guerrilla warfare is largely a matter of tactics and techniques to be adopted by almost anyone who may have need of them in almost any irregular warfare situation. The first view is both naive and cynical, invariably expressed in the rhetoric of Western liberalism and urging political democracy, that is to say, multi-party elections, as the desideratum. Desideratum? It nevertheless lacks confidence in popular decisions. It tacitly assumes that people in the mass are simpletons, too ignorant, unsophisticated, and passive to think for themselves, or to have either the will or the capacity to wage a revolutionary war. Ergo, the revolution which in fact exists must be due to the machinations of interlopers. The guerrillas must be the dupes or the wily agents of an alien power, or, at least, of an alien political philosophy. Footnote. But what can this strange American word alien mean to the Vietnamese, to the Cubans, to the Congolese? Could it mean, shocking thought, American? Main text. On the more naive level, it seems to be assumed that people would scarcely choose the revolutionary path of their own accord. Certainly not if the revolution in question were out of joint with the political traditions and ideals held by dear Americans. Or held dear by Americans. To quote former President Eisenhower in this connection, relative to the war in South Vietnam, quote, "We must inform these people, the South Vietnamese, of what is happening and how important it is to them to get on our side. Then they will want to choose victory." Footnote. In a Republican political forum in Philadelphia urging an intensive propaganda campaign, in quotes, to create a clear, quote, "unity of view between the South Vietnamese people and the United States," end quote, quoted in the New York Times, June 16, 1964. Main text. Alas, the victory they seem to have chosen is not General Eisenhower's. Most American foreign policymakers and experts of the new political military science of counterinsurgency, the theory and practice of counter-revolution, appear more cynical than General Eisenhower. It is manifest in their pronouncements that all modern revolutions are, or are likely to become, struggles between two world systems, the communist on one side, the Americans and their allies on the other, with the people most directly involved merely pawns, to be manipulated by one side or the other. Since it is the United States that is, more often than not, in this era, the interloper in almost any revolutionary situation that comes to mind, Vietnam, Cuba, Iran, Guatemala, Brazil, Congo, Venezuela, to name a few, it is not surprising that the Cold War psychology should lead us to look for our Russian or Chinese counterpart in the given area of contention, and, finding him, or thinking so, to assign to him a major role. To do so, however, is to succumb to a curious illogic, in which our powers of observation seem to fail us. The following excerpt from an article entitled "Plea for Realism in Southeast Asia" by Roger Hilsman, former United States Assistant Secretary of State for Far Eastern Affairs, is fairly typical. Block quote. "Any analysis of the situation in South Vietnam," writes Hilsman, "should probably start with the realization that we are not dealing with a war. The problem is more political than military, involving acts of terrorism rather than battles. Out of a population of 14 million, the communist Viet Cong numbers only 28,000 to 34,000 regular guerrilla troops, plus 60,000 to 80,000 part-time auxiliaries. Its campaign is more like the gangland warfare of the 1930s and the teenage terrorism of New York today than the war in Korea or World War II. In a very real sense, the FBI has had more experience in dealing with this kind of problem than the armed services." Hilsman's article appeared in the New York Times Magazine August 23, 1964. The italics are added, perhaps unnecessarily, putting aside the patent absurdity of his comparisons. Teenage terrorism. Indeed. Hilsman's analysis suffers from grave defects of observations and interpretation. Out of a population that is closer to 16 million than to 14 million, the Viet Cong did not have only 28,000 guerrillas, etc. It had as many as 28,000, and President Johnson's decision early in 1965 to expand the war by the punitive bombing of military targets in North Vietnam made it amply clear how potent a force that was. By way of comparison, Fidel Castro's Cuban guerrillas, fighting on an island with a population of close to 7 million, never at any time exceeded 1,500 armed men. Yet when the decisive Battle of Santa Clara came in December of 1958, cutting the island in two, the whole city, except for the isolated military garrison, became involved in the conflict, and when Batista finally fled the country on the last day of the year, virtually the entire population of Cuba claimed participation in the victory. Far from being isolated or indifferent, all had been rebels, it seemed. With respect to the question of popular support of the Viet Cong in South Vietnam, Hilsman himself admits, quote, "The vast majority of the Viet Cong are recruited in the South, their food and clothing are procured in the South, and they collect taxes in the South to import other supplies through Cambodia." On this same question, Walter Lippmann wrote in the New York Herald Tribune in April 1964, quote, "The truth, which is being obscured for the American people, is that the Saigon government has the allegiance of probably no more than 30% of the people and controls, even in daylight, not much more than a quarter of the national territory." End quote. It should be fairly obvious that when a Vietnamese army of 400,000 men, supported by 2 divisions of American military advisors, an immense armada of fighter planes, jet bombers, and helicopters, and financial infusions on the order of close to $2 million a day, cannot control an insurgency, something more than teenage terrorism is involved. The error that the Viet Cong insurgency is the work of a fanatical minority directed from outside the country nevertheless persists, fostered by Washington for reasons which will be examined in subsequent chapters. Can guerrilla tactics be employed successfully against guerrillas? The answer is negative. To suppose otherwise is to fall into the method's fallacy. Indian fighters do not become Indians by taking scalps. A spotted jungle suit does not make a United States Marine a guerrilla. The experience of World War II and of every conflict since then has made it clear that commando troops are not guerrillas. Nor can the so-called counterinsurgency forces now being developed in a more sophisticated school be considered guerrillas, although they may employ some of the more obvious techniques of the guerrilla fighter: the night raid, the ambush, the roving patrol far from a military base, and so on. Such techniques are as old as warfare itself. It is possible to conceive of their use by Cro-Magnon man, whoever he was, against the last of the Neanderthals. They were employed by the aboriginal Britons against Caesar's legionaries. And they are the techniques of savages in the Colombian jungle, and no doubt of a few surviving New Guinean headhunters to this day. Oh, my nose is stopped up, man. Headhunters are not guerrillas. The distinction is simple enough. When we speak of the guerrilla fighter, we are speaking of the political partisan, an armed civilian whose principal weapon is not his rifle or his machete, but his relationship to the community, the nation, in and for which he fights. Insurgency or guerrilla war is the agency of radical social or political change. It is the face and the right arm of revolution. Counterinsurgency is a form of counter-revolution, the process by which revolution is resisted. The two are opposite sides of the coin. And it will not do to confuse them or their agents, despite superficial similarities. Because of the political nature of the struggle, the disparity of the means at the disposal of the two forces, and, above all, the total opposition of their strategic aims, the most fundamental tactics of the guerrilla simply are not available to the army that opposes him, and are available only in the most limited way to the counterinsurgency specialist, the United States Special Forces officer, let us say, who may try to imitate him. The reasons are clear. First, the guerrilla has the initiative. It is he who begins the war, and he who decides when and where to strike. His military opponent must wait, and while waiting, he must be on guard everywhere. Both before and after the war has begun, the government army is in a defensive position, by reason of its role as policeman, which is to say, as the guardian of public and private property. The military has extensive holdings to protect cities, towns, villages, agricultural lands, communications, commerce, and usually some sort of industrial base to defend. There is also the purely military investment to consider: garrisons, outposts, supply lines, convoys, airfields, the troops themselves, and their valuable weapons, which it will be the first tactical objective of the guerrillas to capture, so as to arm more guerrillas. Finally, there is a political system, already under severe strain, if the point of open insurrection has been reached, to be preserved and strengthened. In all of these areas, the incumbent regime and its military arm present highly vulnerable targets to an enemy who is himself as elusive and insubstantial as the wind. For, while the army suffers from an embarrassment of wealth, and especially of expensive military hardware for which there is no employment, the guerrilla has the freedom of his property. He owns nothing but his rifle and the shirt on his back, has nothing to defend but his existence. He holds no territory, has no expensive and cumbersome military establishment to maintain, no tanks to risk in battle, no garrison subject to siege, no transport vulnerable to air attack, nor aircraft of his own to be shot down, no massed divisions to be bombarded, no motor columns to be ambushed, no bases or depots that he cannot abandon within the hour. He can afford to run when he cannot stand and fight with good assurance of winning, and to disperse and hide when it is not safe to move. In the extremity, he can always sink back into the peaceful population, that sea, to use Mao Tse-tung's well-worn metaphor, in which the guerrilla swims like a fish. The population, as should be clear by now, is the key to the entire struggle. Indeed, although Western analysts seem to dislike entertaining this idea, it is the population which is doing the struggling. The guerrilla, who is of the people in a way which the government soldier cannot be, for if the regime were not alienated from the people, whence the revolution, fights with the support of the non-combatant civilian populace. It is his camouflage, his quartermaster, his recruiting office, his communications network, and his efficient all-seeing intelligence service. Without the consent and active aid of the people, the guerrilla would be merely a bandit and could not long survive. If, on the other hand, the counterinsurgent could claim this same support, the guerrilla would not exist because there would be no war, no revolution. The cause would have evaporated. The popular impulse toward radical change, cause or no cause, would be dead. Here again we come to the vital questions of aims, on which the strategy and tactics of both sides are necessarily based. The guerrilla fighter is primarily a propagandist, an agitator, a disseminator of the revolutionary idea who uses the struggle itself, the actual physical conflict, as an instrument of agitation. His primary goal is to raise the level of revolutionary anticipation and then of popular participation to the crisis point at which the revolution becomes general throughout the country and the people in their masses carry out that final task, the destruction of the existing order and, often but not always, of the army that defends it. By contrast, the purpose, the counter-revolutionary, is negative and defensive. It is to restore order, to protect property, to preserve existing forms and interests by force of arms, where persuasion has already failed. His means may be political insofar as they involve the use of still more persuasion, the promise of social and economic reforms, bribes of a more localized sort, counter-propaganda of various kinds. But primarily, the counterinsurgent's task must be to destroy the revolution by destroying its promise. That means by proving militarily that it cannot and will not succeed. To do so will require the total defeat of the revolutionary vanguard and its piecemeal destruction wherever it exists. The alternatives will be to abdicate the military effort in favor of a political solution. For example, the partition of Vietnam, after the French defeat at Dien Bien Phu, the Algerian solution, etc. In other words, compromise or complete surrender. That military victory against true guerrillas is possible. The military victory against true guerrillas is possible seems doubtful on the basis of modern experience, barring the use of methods approaching genocide as applied notably by the Germans in certain occupied countries during World War II. The counterinsurgent cannot win by imitating the insurgent, because he is the alien in the revolutionary situation, and because his tasks are precisely the opposite of those of the guerrilla, where symmetry exists at all. The guerrilla's mere survival is a political victory. It encourages and raises the popular opposition to the incumbent regime. Thus he can afford to run and to hide. The counterinsurgent gains nothing by running and hiding. He surrenders everything. The guerrilla can disguise himself as, in fact he can be, a peaceful agrarian worker, and still spread his revolutionary message. In a similar role, the counterinsurgent would be merely a police spy and would accomplish little, spread no message. The guerrilla can hit and run. Every successful raid gives him more arms and ammunition and more favorable publicity. The counterinsurgent can gain nothing by such Red Indian tactics, even if similar targets were available to him, and they are not. His military campaign must be sweeping, continuous, and cumulative in its effects. Either he clears the country of guerrillas or he does not. If he does not, he continues to lose. The distinction made here between guerrilla war as a politico-military technique and the mere guerrillaism, banditry on the one hand, or the application of irregular warfare techniques by regular military organizations on the other, is by no means as arbitrary as it may at first appear. Popular insurrections have occurred throughout history. They have usually failed, or in any case have produced only limited victories, because the techniques they can exploit today were then irrelevant to the historical situation. This is simply another way of saying that, until now, the popular majorities, the laboring, unspecialized masses of pre-industrial societies, were able to exert very little political or economic leverage. The serfs of the medieval period, for example, were unable to resist the feudal military power not merely because they lacked arms and skills, political consciousness and cohesion, but because they had no other means to affect the political and economic process of their world. Economically, they were manageable because they lived too close to the level of bare subsistence to be otherwise. They could not even think of withholding their labor, their only economic lever. Isolated by their brute condition and their ignorance, they lived below the level of politics. If they starved or rebelled and were slaughtered, there was no one to care, no economically or politically potent class to whom it would make the slightest difference. Subsequent revolutions from the Renaissance to the Russian Revolution, and not excluding Mexico 1910 to 1917, have been bourgeois in character or have quickly been converted into bourgeois movements after an initially populist period. Liberté, égalité, fraternité applied only to the great and petite bourgeoisie of France after a brief Jacobin interval. Significantly, all bourgeois historians loathe and fear the proletarianism of the Terror, because in the end only the bourgeoisie had the lever, wealth and the tools of production to assume leadership in a confrontation with the landowning feudal aristocracy. Although there was some class mobility and a greater need of democratic slogans, the landless, unspecialized masses remained submerged. They could remain idle and starve. All the better. It reduced beggary and banditry. Isolated, they could be slaughtered, and no one would care. History brings us to a pass in which, for a variety of reasons, but principally because of the complexity of the productive processes, the fragmentation, specialization, and interlocking nature of the industrial society, and the importance of disciplined labor and huge consumer markets relative to the profit system, the laboring masses assume political potency. Their new role in the industrial society as producer, as distributor, as consumer, gives them a lever. If they withhold their work, the economy collapses. If they cease to buy and to consume, the same thing happens. If they are slaughtered, there are worldwide repercussions based in the final analysis on economic considerations. The modern industrial society cannot function, and its government cannot govern, except with popular participation and by popular consent. What is true of the industrial state is also true, with minor qualification, of the non-industrial states and colonies on which the former depend for the raw materials of their industry and, often, for their export markets. For the best of economic reasons, modern governments must seem to be popular. They must make great concessions to popular notions of what is democratic and just, or be replaced by regimes that will do so. The governments of the dominant industrial states themselves, even more than those they dominate, are strapped politically by this factor of the domestic image. They must use the liberal rhetoric and also pay something in the way of social compromise, schools, hospitals, decent concern for the well-being of all but the most isolated poor, if they are to retain power and keep the people to their accustomed profit-producing tasks. This fact makes such governments extremely vulnerable to a sort of war. Guerrilla war with its psychological and economic weapons, that their predecessors could have ignored had such a war been possible at all in the past. They are vulnerable because they must, at all cost, keep the economy functioning and showing a profit or providing the materials and markets on which another dominant economy depends. Again, they are vulnerable because they must maintain the appearance of normalcy. They can be embarrassed out of office, and they are triply vulnerable because they cannot be as ruthless as the situation demands. They cannot openly crush the opposition that embarrasses and harasses them. They must be wooers as well as doers. These are modern weaknesses. They invite a distinctly modern development to exploit them, and that development is modern guerrilla warfare. The weakness is peculiar to the modern bourgeois democratic capitalistic state, but shared in some measure by all modern states, because popular was made possible, and give it its distinctive forms which clearly cannot be imitated, except in the most superficial way, by the armies of the state itself. Fundamentally, the guerrilla's tactics and those of the counterinsurgent differ because their roles differ. They are dissimilar forces fighting dissimilar wars for disparate objectives. The counterinsurgent seeks a military solution, to wipe out the guerrillas. He is hampered by a political and economic impediment. He cannot wipe out the populist or any significant sector of it. The guerrilla, for his part, wishes to wear down his military opponent and will employ suitable tactics to that end, but his primary objective is political. It is to feed and fan the fires of revolution by his struggle, to raise the entire population against the regime, to discredit it, isolate it, wreck its credit, undermine its economy, overextend its resources, and cause its disintegration. Essentially, then, the guerrilla fighter's war is political and social. His means are at least as political as they are military, because, his purpose is almost entirely so. Thus, we may I'll start that over. Essentially, then, the guerrilla fighter's war is political and social. His means are at least as political as they are military. His purpose is almost entirely so. Thus, we may paraphrase Clausewitz, guerrilla war is the extension of politics by means of armed conflict. From his book On War, I'm assuming. At a certain point in its development, it becomes revolution itself, the dragon's teeth sprung to maturity. Guerrilla war equals revolutionary war, the extension of politics by means of armed conflict. Until this much is properly understood by those who would oppose it, nothing else about it can be understood, and no strategy or tactics devised to suppress it can prevail. If, on the other hand, this much is understood by those who lead it, then it can scarcely fail in any circumstance, for the war will not even begin until all the conditions of its success are present. Let us now begin to examine the mechanics of the revolutionary process called guerrilla warfare. And that'll end Chapter 1.